The snap of a leather heel against marble echoed through St. Michael's Cathedral like a gunshot. Every head in the chapel turned toward the center aisle, where 28-year-old Claire Dennison froze mid-step, her left foot tilted at an impossible angle, the broken shoe dangling uselessly from her trembling ankle. Because in 1984, Washington, a single mother marrying above her station, was already walking a tightrope, and now that rope had just turned to glass. Claire had woken that morning in the cramped apartment above Henderson's Hardware on 4th Street, the same 2 rooms where she'd raised her daughter Emma for 6 years on a cashier's salary and pure stubborn will. The dress she wore, cream silk with delicate lace sleeves, had taken 9 months of layaway payments. The shoes, purchased second-hand from a consignment shop in Georgetown, had seemed like a small miracle when she'd found them in her size. Patent leather pumps with a modest heel, polished until they gleamed like new money. She should have known better than to trust miracles. The morning had tasted like hope and terror in equal measure. Emma had helped her pin wildflowers, daisies and baby's breath gathered from the park, into her honey-colored hair. Her daughter's small hands had been so careful, so gentle, tongue pressed between her teeth in concentration. "You look like a princess, Mama," Emma had whispered, her gray eyes wide with wonder. Now, standing in the cathedral's center aisle with 200 guests staring and the October light streaming through stained glass in fractured rainbows, Claire felt anything but royal. Laughter rippled through the pews. Not cruel, exactly. More nervous, uncertain. The kind of sound people make when they witness someone else's humiliation and don't know whether to pretend they haven't noticed or acknowledge the catastrophe. Claire's fiancé, Richard Whitmore, stood at the altar in his navy dress whites, his face caught between concern and something else. Embarrassment, maybe. Or regret? His mother sat in the front row, lips pressed into a line so thin it might have been drawn with a ruler, her pearl necklace catching the light like a noose of expensive judgment. But it was Richard's father who moved first. Colonel James Whitmore, decorated veteran, steel magnate, a man whose handshake could close business deals worth millions, stood from his seat with the slow deliberation of someone making a choice that mattered. He was 63, silver-haired, his suit tailored to perfection, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. The kind of man who commanded rooms simply by entering them. He walked toward Claire with measured steps, and the laughter died. The cathedral held its breath. When he reached her, he didn't speak. Instead, he knelt. This powerful man in his expensive suit knelt on the cold marble floor and began unlacing his own Oxford shoes. Black leather, Italian-made, probably, worth more than Claire's entire month's rent. "Sir, you don't have to," Claire whispered, her voice breaking. "Yes," he said quietly, looking up at her with eyes that held something she couldn't name. "I do." He slipped the shoes from his own feet and placed them gently on the marble before her. Then, with infinite care, he removed the broken heel from her left foot and guided her into his shoes. They were too large, of course, comically so, but he tied the laces tight and double-knotted them with the precision of a man who'd spent decades making things work through sheer determination. "There," he said, still kneeling. "Now you can walk." Claire stared down at this man, this pillar of Washington society, kneeling before her in his socks, and something ancient and complicated moved through her chest. "Colonel, Walk, Claire," he said, and his voice carried through the cathedral like a benediction. "Walk toward my son. You've earned every step. Before we go any further, Whether you're having your morning coffee in California or winding down for the night somewhere across the ocean, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. And if this story already has you hooked, hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me, you'll want to see where this goes. As Claire took her first tentative step in the Colonel's shoes, Richard's mother audibly gasped. But Emma, sweet 6-year-old Emma in her flower girl dress, began to clap. Her small hands creating a rhythm that slowly, impossibly, the rest of the congregation picked up. Claire walked the remaining distance to the altar, and with each step she could feel the weight of the Colonel's gesture, the strange certainty in his voice when he'd said she'd earned this. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that Colonel James Whitmore knew exactly who she was. And the debt he was repaying went back further than anyone in that cathedral could imagine. What had Claire Dennison done to earn the loyalty of one of Washington's most powerful men? The wedding reception unfolded in the Whitmore Estates ballroom, like something from a magazine Claire had once flipped through in a dentist's waiting room. Crystal chandeliers cast prisms of light across tables draped in ivory silk, and waiters in white gloves circulated with champagne that probably cost more per bottle than Claire made in a week. Emma sat at the head table, her flower crown slightly askew, watching the whole affair with the wide-eyed fascination of a child who'd stumbled into a fairy tale. But Claire couldn't stop watching the Colonel. He'd changed into a spare pair of shoes. Apparently, the Whitmore estate kept entire wardrobes on hand for emergencies. And now he moved through the crowd with the ease of someone who'd spent a lifetime at such events. Yet every few minutes, his eyes would find hers across the room, and something unspoken would pass between them. Recognition. "Your father was very kind," Claire said to Richard during their first dance, her voice barely audible over the string quartet. Richard glanced toward where his father stood talking with a congressman. "He's full of surprises," he said, but there was something careful in his tone, something that suggested he was as confused by his father's gesture as everyone else. The October evening deepened into night, and eventually Claire found herself on the estate's stone terrace, needing air, needing space from the weight of so many curious stares. The Potomac River stretched out below, dark and eternal, and the smell of autumn leaves mixed with expensive perfume from the party inside. "You're wondering why I did it." Claire turned to find Colonel Whitmore standing in the doorway, 2 glasses of champagne in his hands. He offered her one, and she accepted it out of pure reflex. "Sir, James," he corrected gently. "We're family now. You can call me James." They stood in silence for a moment, and Claire felt the question burning in her throat. But before she could ask, he spoke again. 1978, he said quietly. "August? Do you remember that month?" Claire's heart stumbled. August of 1978. 6 years ago. Emma had been just a baby, and Claire had been 22, newly divorced, working double shifts at Henderson's Hardware to keep their tiny apartment. Those had been the darkest months of her life, exhausted, terrified, convinced she was drowning and that no one would notice when she finally went under. "I remember," she whispered. "There was a man who came into the hardware store," James continued, his eyes distant. "Middle of the afternoon. He was looking for rope, strong rope, the kind that could hold significant weight." Claire's champagne glass trembled in her hand. She remembered. The man had been disheveled, his suit expensive but rumpled, his eyes hollow in a way that made Claire's instincts scream danger. Not danger to her, danger to himself. She'd been stocking shelves, Emma, sleeping in a carrier on her back, and something about the way the man had asked for the rope. The way his voice had been so flat and final had made her stomach turn. "You refused to sell it to him," James said, and now his voice was thick with emotion. "You told him the store was out of stock. Then you called your manager over and whispered something, and suddenly there was a mistake with the register. And you spent 20 minutes talking to this stranger about nothing at all, about the weather, about your baby daughter, about how hard life gets sometimes, but how it also gets better." Claire's vision blurred with tears. "You made him coffee from that ancient pot in the break room," James continued. "Terrible coffee, by the way. Worst I've ever tasted. But you sat with him, this complete stranger, for an hour while your manager watched the floor. And when he finally left, you'd convinced him to go home, to call someone, to wait one more day." The river rushed below them, endless and dark. "That man was me," James Whitmore said quietly. "Family isn't always blood." Claire turned to face him fully, and in the terrace light she could see tears tracking down his weathered cheeks. "My company was failing," he said. "The steel industry was collapsing, and I'd made bad investments, trusted the wrong partners. We were losing everything: the business my grandfather built, the fortune that was supposed to secure my son's future. My wife was sick with cancer, and the medical bills were drowning us. I'd taken out loans I couldn't repay, made promises I couldn't keep." He set his champagne glass on the stone railing with a hand that shook slightly. "That afternoon, I'd decided to end it. I'd written the notes, settled my affairs as best I could, picked out a bridge. But I needed rope as a backup plan, because I'm nothing if not thorough. And then this young woman with a baby on her back looked at me with these eyes that somehow saw exactly what I was planning, and she refused to help me die." Claire's tears were falling freely now. "I didn't know who you were." "I know. That's what made it matter." James smiled, but it was fractured, beautiful in its brokenness. "You saw a human being in pain, and you chose to care. For an hour, you made me feel like maybe the world wouldn't be worse off without me in it. You told me about how scared you'd been after your divorce, how some mornings you didn't know how you'd make it through the day. But you did. You kept going. For her." He gestured toward the ballroom, where Emma could be seen through the windows, dancing with Richard's younger sister. "When I left that hardware store, I went home. I called a crisis line. I talked to my wife, really talked to her for the first time in months. And we fought. God, we fought our way back from the edge together." The story hung between them like a bridge across years. 2 months later, one of my former investors reached out with a lifeline, a merger opportunity I never would have seen if I'd been gone. Within a year, the company was stable again. Within 3, we'd tripled our revenue. My wife lived another 4 years, Claire. 4 years I wouldn't have had with her if not for you." Claire couldn't speak. She'd served thousands of customers at Henderson's Hardware over the years. She'd forgotten most of them within minutes of their transactions. But she remembered that afternoon, remembered the hollow-eyed man and the desperate certainty that she needed to stall him, needed to keep him in the world just a little longer. She'd never known if it had mattered. "When Richard told me he was engaged," James said, "and mentioned his fiancée's name and where she worked, I had to be sure. I came to the hardware store 3 weeks ago, watched you from the garden section, and I knew. Same kind eyes, same gentle voice. You were helping an elderly man choose potting soil, taking time to really listen to him talk about his late wife's roses. Why didn't you say something? Because you didn't do it for recognition or reward. You did it because that's who you are. James stepped closer, his voice dropping to something fierce and tender. So today, when your shoe broke and people laughed, when I saw my son's mother sit there judging you for being common and unsuitable, I thought, here is my chance. My chance to say thank you. My chance to show everyone in that cathedral that you are not the one who should feel grateful to be joining this family. We are the ones who should be grateful that you've chosen us. The weight of 6 years of unknowing settled into something else, something like grace. You saved my life, Claire Dennison. The least I can do is make sure you can walk tall in my son's. Behind them, the ballroom music swelled, a waltz, timeless and sure. But what neither of them knew was that Richard's mother had been standing just inside the doorway for the last 5 minutes, and Margaret Whitmore did not appreciate having her judgment called into question. The Whitmore family breakfast table had always been a place of performance, not intimacy. Margaret Whitmore sat at its head 3 mornings after the wedding, her coffee cooling in bone china as she reviewed the trust documents her lawyer had delivered at dawn. The November rain hammered against the dining room windows of the Georgetown townhouse, and somewhere in the kitchen, the housekeeper was preparing eggs that Margaret wouldn't eat. She'd spent 61 years perfecting the art of control over her emotions, her household, her social standing. But her husband's gesture at the wedding had been an act of open rebellion, and Margaret did not forgive rebellion, especially when it came wrapped in cream silk and carried the taint of 4th Street poverty. The prenuptial agreement is ironclad, her lawyer, Theodore Vance, assured her through the phone pressed to her ear. Richard's inheritance is protected. Even if the marriage lasts, she can't touch the Whitmore Steel assets or the estate holdings. That's not enough, Margaret said quietly, because she'd heard every word her husband had spoken on that terrace. She'd stood in the shadow of the doorway, champagne bitter on her tongue, and listened to James rewrite their family history to center some nobody cashier who'd apparently performed one moment of basic human decency 6 years ago. Basic human decency that Margaret herself had been too busy to notice when her husband had been drowning. The guilt she felt about that failure had long since calcified into something harder, something that needed someone else to blame. Mrs. Whitmore, Theodore said carefully, what exactly are you asking me to do? Margaret set down her coffee cup with a click that was almost delicate. I'm asking you to help me protect my son's future from a gold digger who's already manipulated his father into playing fairy godfather. The truth was more complicated, and Margaret knew it. But truth was malleable when you had enough money and enough rage. Across town, in the small duplex that Richard had rented for his new family, modest by Whitmore standards, palatial by Claire's, Emma was singing while she colored at the kitchen table. Her voice was off-key but joyful, something about sunshine and rainbows, and Claire felt her heart swell with a happiness so fragile it terrified her. "Mama, can we get a cat?" Emma asked, not looking up from her drawing of what appeared to be a purple elephant wearing a crown. "Maybe, sweetheart. We'll see." "That means no," Emma said with 6-year-old wisdom, but she was smiling. Richard emerged from the bedroom, already dressed in his uniform. He was stationed at the Pentagon now, working in naval intelligence, a position his father's connections had certainly helped secure. He kissed Claire's cheek with the distracted affection of a man already thinking about his day's obligations. "I'll be late tonight," he said. "Meeting with the Admiral." Of course. Claire had learned not to expect more. Their marriage was 3 days old, but already she could feel the pattern establishing itself. Richard would be busy, important, essential elsewhere. and she would be here, grateful for small mercies and trying not to notice the spaces he didn't fill. Still, he was kind. He loved Emma, or was learning to, and Claire had learned long ago not to expect fairy tales. She'd stopped believing in those the night her first husband had left, taking their savings and her naive faith in happy endings with him. The morning unfolded in ordinary rhythms. Emma dressed for school, Claire packed lunches, Richard left in his pressed uniform. But when Claire opened the front door to walk Emma to the bus stop, she found an envelope on the doormat. Heavy paper, expensive, no return address. Inside, a single sheet of Whitmore family letterhead and handwriting she didn't recognize but somehow knew belonged to Margaret. Claire, we should talk. Today. Henderson's Hardware, noon. Come alone. M.W. Some invitations are really summons. Claire felt cold spread through her chest despite the wool coat she wore. She'd barely spoken to Richard's mother at the wedding. Margaret had offered congratulations with a smile that never reached her eyes, had made polite conversation that felt like a test Claire wasn't sure she'd passed. But this note carried no pretense of politeness. "Mama, we're going to miss the bus," Emma called from the sidewalk. Claire folded the note and slipped it into her pocket. "Comin', baby." At noon, Henderson's Hardware smelled exactly as it always had, of sawdust and machine oil and the particular mustiness of a building that had stood on 4th Street since 1947. Claire had called in sick to her shift, her first sick day in 6 years, and now she stood in aisle 3 among the paintbrushes and turpentine, waiting. Margaret Whitmore arrived precisely on time, looking absurdly out of place in her Chanel suit and pearl earrings. She moved through the hardware store like a foreign dignitary touring a disaster zone, taking in the scuffed floors, the flickering fluorescent lights, the clearance bins with the expression somewhere between pity and contempt. "This is where you work," Margaret said. Not a question. "This is where I worked," Claire corrected quietly. "Richard asked me to take some time off, to settle into our new life." "How convenient." Margaret's smile was surgical. "And how long do you think that new life will last, Claire?" The rain hammered on the store's metal roof, and somewhere in the back, Claire's former manager was helping a customer with plumbing fixtures. The ordinary world continued, oblivious to the confrontation taking shape among the hardware. "Mrs. Whitmore, if you have something to say—" "I heard what my husband told you. On the terrace." Margaret's voice was low, controlled, but underneath it Claire could hear something raw. "About the rope. About how you saved him." Claire said nothing. "And maybe you did," Margaret continued. "Maybe you talked him down from whatever ledge he'd climbed onto. But do you know what I was doing that August? I was undergoing chemotherapy. I was losing my hair, vomiting up every meal, trying to pretend I wasn't terrified I was dying. And my husband was so consumed by his financial failures that he couldn't see I needed him." The words landed like blows, and Claire felt her certainty waver. "So forgive me," Margaret said, her voice shaking now, "if I don't feel particularly grateful that a stranger gave my husband 1 hour of comfort during the months when I begged him to look at me. Really look at me. And he couldn't." Claire's throat tightened. "Mrs. Whitmore, I didn't know—" "Of course you didn't know. You were 22 years old with a baby and your own problems. You were just trying to get through your shift." Margaret stepped closer, and Claire could see the tears she was refusing to shed. "But my husband has rewritten that afternoon into some grand salvation narrative where you're the angel and I'm—" "What? The wife who wasn't enough to keep him alive?" The truth was uglier than either of them wanted to acknowledge. "I don't think that," Claire said quietly. "I would never—" "It doesn't matter what you think." Margaret's voice hardened again, the vulnerability shuddering closed. "What matters is that James has decided you're some kind of saint, and he's using that fantasy to excuse welcoming you into a family you don't belong in. A family you can't possibly understand." "I'm trying." "You're trying to survive," Margaret cut her off. "I understand that. I'm not cruel, Claire. I know what it's like to be desperate. But desperation doesn't make you entitled to my son's inheritance or my family's legacy. And that's what this marriage is really about, isn't it? Security, stability, a rescue from 4th Street poverty." Claire felt anger kindle in her chest, clean, bright anger that burned away the fear. "I love your son. Do you? Or do you love what he represents?" Margaret pulled a folder from her handbag. "This is a post-nuptial agreement. Very generous terms. If the marriage ends within 5 years, you'll receive $100,000. More than enough to build a comfortable life for you and Emma." The folder hung between them like a grenade. "You're asking me to agree to leave him. I'm giving you an exit strategy, because this won't last, Claire. Richard is used to a certain kind of woman, educated, sophisticated, connected. Eventually, he'll realize what he's given up to play savior to a single mother. And when that happens, wouldn't you rather leave with dignity? With enough money to start over somewhere new?" Claire looked at this woman, this wife who'd survived cancer and a husband's near suicide and decades of social performance, and saw something she recognized. Not cruelty, exactly. Fear. The same fear Claire had felt every month when rent was due and her bank account was empty. The same fear that made people do desperate things. But understanding didn't mean accepting. "No," Claire said quietly. Margaret blinked. "Excuse me?" "No, I won't sign anything that assumes my marriage is going to fail." Claire held the older woman's gaze. "I'm sorry your husband couldn't see you when you needed him. I'm sorry that my connection to him makes you feel erased. But I'm not leaving Richard. And I'm not apologizing for being born poor or for having the nerve to marry your son." For a moment, something like respect flickered across Margaret's face. Then it was gone, replaced by cold determination. "Then you'll leave me no choice," Margaret said softly. "If you won't protect my family's interests willingly, I'll have to do it another way." She turned and walked out of the hardware store, leaving the folder on the paint-stained floor. Claire stood alone among the brushes and turpentine and felt the first cold touch of real fear. Because women like Margaret Whitmore didn't make threats they couldn't carry out. What was Richard's mother planning? The whisper campaign began so subtly that Claire almost missed it. A phone call from Emma's school 3 weeks after the hardware store confrontation. "Could Mrs. Whitmore please come in to discuss Emma's adjustment issues?" The teacher's voice had been careful, concerned, using words like acting out and disruptive behavior to describe a child who'd never gotten so much as a warning before. Then Richard's commander mentioned, almost casually over dinner at the officers' club, that he'd heard Richard had family complications that might affect his security clearance review. Nothing serious, of course. Just routine questions about his wife's background, her first marriage, her ex-husband's whereabouts. Claire's ex-husband who disappeared into the Texas oil fields 6 years ago and hadn't been heard from since. It's standard procedure, Richard assured her that night, loosening his tie with the exhaustion of a man fighting battles on multiple fronts. They're just being thorough. But Claire knew better. She'd grown up poor, which meant she'd learned early how power worked. The wealthy didn't need to shout or threaten. They just made phone calls, had quiet conversations, planted seeds of doubt in the right ears, and watched them grow into forests of suspicion. Margaret Whitmore was a master gardener. The December cold settled over Washington like a judgment, and James Whitmore's health began to fail with a speed that terrified everyone. The robust 63-year-old who'd knelt on cathedral marble was replaced by a gaunt figure who tired easily, who struggled to catch his breath after climbing stairs, whose hands shook when he signed documents. Just a virus, he insisted when Claire visited him at the Georgetown townhouse, bringing homemade soup and Emma's latest drawings. Nothing that won't pass. But his eyes held a knowledge that made Claire's stomach clench. Margaret hovered in doorways during these visits, watchful as a hawk, saying nothing but radiating disapproval like heat from a furnace. The message was clear. You are an intruder here. You are the infection we cannot purge. Tell me about your mother, James said one afternoon in mid-December, his voice weak but curious. He was propped up in bed, Emma sitting beside him and carefully showing him how to make a paper crane from the origami book Claire had bought at the public library. My mother? Claire settled into the chair beside the bed. She died when I was 15. Cancer. I'm sorry. James watched Emma's small fingers fold and crease with intense concentration. Was she like you? Claire smiled despite the old grief. She was tougher than me. Worked 3 jobs after my father left. Cleaned office buildings at night. Waitressed during the day. Took in sewing on weekends. She never complained. Never let me see her cry, though I know she must have. That's where you learned it, James observed. Learned what? How to see people who are drowning. How to recognize the ones who need someone to notice them. His breathing was labored, each word an effort. Your mother probably saw a lot of desperate people in those office buildings, a lot of lonely nights and empty rooms. Emma triumphantly held up a slightly lopsided crane. Look, Grandpa James, I did it. It's perfect, he said, and his smile was genuine despite the pain Claire could see behind it. Can I keep it? Of course. Emma placed it carefully on his bedside table, next to his medications and a water glass. Mama says if you make 1,000 cranes, you get a wish. Then we'd better get started. Small hands can carry great love. After Emma ran downstairs to find cookies in the kitchen, Margaret had learned quickly that being cruel to the child would turn even Richard against her. James reached for Claire's hand. She's getting worse, he said quietly. Margaret, I can feel it. She's scared, Claire replied, surprising herself with the generosity. Scared of losing control. Scared of losing you. She lost me years ago. We just both pretended otherwise. James closed his eyes, exhausted by the small effort of conversation. After she recovered from the cancer, something changed between us. We couldn't find our way back to who we'd been before. I'd nearly abandoned her when she needed me most, and she couldn't forgive that. I couldn't forgive myself. Maybe there's still time. No. His grip on her hand tightened. But there's time to do right by you, to make sure Richard doesn't let his mother poison what you two are building. Claire thought about the distance growing between her and her husband, the way Richard came home later each night, the way he'd started questioning small things. Why had she bought generic brand cereal instead of the name brand? Why did she insist on taking the bus when he could arrange for a car service? Why did she still dress like someone who shopped at thrift stores? Small things, but small things compounded into continental divides. Promise me something, James said, opening his eyes again. Promise me you won't let her make you small. You saved my life by seeing my humanity when I'd forgotten it existed. Don't let Margaret, or anyone, convince you that your humanity is a weakness." Before Claire could respond, Margaret appeared in the doorway. "Visiting hours are over," she said crisply. "James needs his rest." Claire squeezed James's hand once more and stood. "I'll bring Emma back tomorrow." "No," Margaret said. "That won't be necessary. James's doctors have advised limiting visitors. Too much stimulation is exhausting him." James started to protest, but a coughing fit seized him. Wet, rattling, frightening. Margaret was at his side immediately, supporting him, calling for the nurse, her movements efficient and practiced and surprisingly gentle. For a moment, Claire saw them as they must have been decades ago, young and in love, before cancer and financial ruin and suicide attempts had carved canyons between them. "I'll see myself out," Claire said quietly. She collected Emma from the kitchen and left through the front door, feeling Margaret's eyes on her back like a physical weight. In the foyer, she passed a man in an expensive suit. Theodore Vance, she'd learn later, though at the time he was just another stranger in the Whitmore orbit. "Mrs. Whitmore?" he said, stopping her. "Yes?" He handed her an envelope. "You've been served." Claire's hands went numb as she opened it. Legal documents. Dense paragraphs of whereas and party of the first part, and hereinafter referred to as. But the essential meaning was clear enough. Margaret Whitmore was suing for grandparents' rights, claiming that Claire was an unfit mother, that Emma's welfare required regular, court-mandated contact with her paternal grandmother, that the child's best interests demanded supervision by responsible family members, given the mother's history of financial instability, questionable judgment, and associations with persons of ill repute. The persons of ill repute being Claire's ex-husband, who'd been arrested twice for drunk and disorderly conduct before he'd disappeared. "This is insane," Claire whispered. "I'm just the messenger," Theodore said, but there was something apologetic in his expression, something that suggested even he found this distasteful. Emma tugged at Claire's coat. "Mama, what's wrong?" "Nothing, baby. Let's go home." But everything was wrong. The lawsuit wasn't really about Emma. It was about destroying Claire's credibility, about creating a public record of her unsuitability, about ensuring that when Richard finally came to his senses and realized his mistake, there would be documentation to support the family's version of events. The gold digger, the unfit mother, the woman who'd manipulated a dying man's gratitude into a wedding ring. That night, after Emma was asleep, Claire sat at the kitchen table and tried to call Richard. His secretary said he was in a classified briefing. Unavailable. She'd have him return the call. He didn't call back. At 3 a.m, Claire stood at Emma's bedroom door and watched her daughter sleep. One arm flung over her head, covers kicked off despite the December cold, a stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest. This child who'd been born into poverty and chaos, but who somehow radiated joy and trust and uncomplicated love. Claire would burn the world down before she let Margaret Whitmore take her. But Margaret had money and lawyers and social standing, and Claire had a husband who wasn't answering her calls. What happens when the people who are supposed to protect you become the ones you need protection from? The courthouse on January 9th, 1985, smelled of floor wax and broken promises. Claire sat in the hallway outside family court, her court-appointed lawyer, a tired woman named Susan Reeves who was juggling 14 other cases, reviewing documents with the distracted efficiency of someone who'd already decided this was a losing battle. Grandparents' rights cases are tricky, Susan said, not unkindly. Especially when the grandparent in question has resources and character witnesses. Margaret Whitmore has lined up 3 child psychologists, a social worker, and statements from 4 teachers at Emma's school. Statements saying what? Claire's voice was steady, but her hands trembled in her lap. That Emma seems anxious, that she's mentioned missing her old apartment, her old routine, that the transition to her new life has been difficult. Susan closed the folder. They're painting a picture of a child in distress, and they're suggesting that regular contact with a stable, loving grandmother would provide necessary continuity. Margaret barely knows Emma. She's met her exactly twice. That's not quite how they're framing it. Susan's expression was sympathetic but resigned. Look, Mrs. Whitmore, the best outcome here is a compromise. Supervised visits once a month. It's not what Margaret is asking for, but the judge might see it as reasonable. No. Susan sighed. Claire, I understand your anger, but we need to be realistic about... I said no. Claire stood, her cheap skirt, purchased specifically for court, the best she could afford, suddenly feeling like a costume. Emma is my daughter, not a pawn in Margaret Whitmore's war against me. Then you'd better pray your husband shows up to testify on your behalf. But Richard hadn't shown up at all. He'd left for Norfolk 3 days ago, an emergency training exercise, his commander said, though Claire suspected his mother had arranged the convenient deployment. He'd called once, his voice crackling with distance and exhaustion, promising he'd fix this. But fix it how? From a naval base 3 hours away while his mother systematically dismantled his wife's credibility. Claire was alone, or so she thought. Mrs. Whitmore? A woman's voice, unfamiliar, coming from down the hallway. Claire turned to find a black woman in her 40s, dressed in a practical gray suit, carrying a briefcase that looked like it had survived several wars. Her face was intelligent, watchful, and carried the particular expression of someone who'd learned to read power dynamics from the outside. I'm Diane Foster, attorney, and before you say you already have representation, she glanced at Susan Reeves with professional courtesy. I'm here pro bono, courtesy of someone who believes you're getting a raw deal. Courtesy of who? A mutual friend who prefers to remain anonymous for now. Diane set her briefcase on the hallway bench. But I've spent the last 3 weeks investigating Margaret Whitmore's claims, and I think we can dismantle this case fairly thoroughly, if you'll let me help. Claire looked at Susan, who was studying Diane with the wary respect of someone recognizing a superior predator. You're from Morrison and Associates, Susan said. Corporate litigation. Big money. Usually, Diane agreed, but sometimes the interesting cases are the ones that don't pay. She turned back to Claire. I reviewed the psychological evaluations that Margaret's team submitted. They're sloppy, leading questions, conclusions that don't match the actual data. And the teacher statements? 3 of those 4 teachers received substantial donations to their classroom supply funds from the Whitmore Foundation last month. Claire felt hope flicker to life in her chest. That's bribery. It's complicated, Diane corrected. But it's enough to raise questions about bias, and questions are what we need. She checked her watch. We've got 20 minutes before the judge calls us. Here's what's going to happen. Justice sometimes arrives in practical gray suits. The courtroom was smaller than Claire had imagined, more institutional. Wood paneling gone dull with age, fluorescent lights humming overhead, an American flag in the corner that needed pressing. Judge Patricia Moreno presided with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd heard every lie and excused the human condition, could produce. Margaret sat on the plaintiff's side, Theodore Vance beside her, looking every inch the concerned grandmother in a navy dress and understated jewelry. When her eyes met Claire's across the aisle, there was no triumph in them, only cold determination. "This isn't personal," that look said. "This is survival." Judge Moreno reviewed the preliminary filings with the speed-reading focus of someone working through a backlog. "Mrs. Whitmore, your petition requests weekly supervised visitation with the minor child Emma Dennison Whitmore, claiming that the mother is unfit due to—" She paused, eyebrows raising slightly. "Financial instability, questionable associations, and inability to provide appropriate stability. That's quite an accusation." "Your Honor," Theodore Vance stood smoothly. "We're not suggesting the mother doesn't love her child. We're simply concerned that a 6-year-old who's been through tremendous upheaval, a hasty marriage, a new home, separation from her previous community, needs the grounding presence of extended family." "Hasty marriage?" Diane was on her feet immediately. "Mrs. Whitmore and her husband dated for 11 months before their engagement. That's hardly hasty by any standard." "Perhaps hasty is the wrong word," Theodore conceded. "But surely Your Honor can see that a child's welfare—" "What I can see," Judge Moreno interrupted, "is a grandmother who had virtually no relationship with this child suddenly demanding court-ordered access. Mrs. Vance—" She glanced at the file. "Excuse me, Mrs. Margaret Whitmore. When did you first meet your granddaughter?" Margaret stood, and Claire had to admire the performance. Perfect posture, perfect diction, the bearing of someone who'd spent 60 years commanding rooms. "I met Emma at the wedding, Your Honor. My son's relationship with Ms. Dennison developed rather quickly, and I regret that I didn't insist on getting to know the child sooner. But now that I understand the instability of Emma's home environment—" "Instability?" Diane pulled a document from her briefcase. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit evidence that Emma's current home is a 2-bedroom duplex in a safe neighborhood with excellent schools. Her mother has no criminal record, no history of abuse or neglect, and by all accounts, unbiased accounts, is a devoted parent. In contrast, Mrs. Margaret Whitmore has submitted psychological evaluations conducted by doctors who've received research grants from Whitmore Steel, and teacher statements from a school that received $20,000 in donations from the Whitmore Foundation the month before these statements were signed." Theodore was on his feet. "Your Honor, those donations were charitable contributions with no strings." "Strings or not," Judge Moreno said dryly, "they create an appearance of bias. Miss Foster, what else do you have?" Diane pulled out another folder. "Testimony from Claire Whitmore's former employer, the manager of Henderson's Hardware, attesting to her reliability, work ethic, and character over 6 years of employment. Testimony from her landlord at her previous residence, confirming she never missed a rent payment and maintained her apartment impeccably. And testimony from Emma's pediatrician, who has no financial connection to anyone in this case, stating that the child is healthy, well-adjusted, and shows no signs of neglect or distress." Claire watched Margaret's expression tighten fractionally. "Additionally," Diane continued, "we have reason to believe this lawsuit is retaliatory in nature. Mrs. Margaret Whitmore approached my client 3 weeks after the wedding with a post-nuptial agreement offering $100,000 if Mrs. Claire Whitmore would agree to divorce her son within 5 years. When my client refused, this lawsuit was filed." "That's a serious allegation," Judge Moreno said. "Can you prove it?" Diane glanced at Claire, who nodded imperceptibly. We have a witness who was present during that conversation and is willing to testify. It was a bluff. Claire had been alone with Margaret at the hardware store. But it landed. Margaret leaned toward Theodore, whispering urgently. His expression shifted from confident to concerned. Judge Moreno sat back in her chair. Let me be very clear. This court exists to protect children, not to weaponize them in family disputes. Mrs. Margaret Whitmore, if I find even a hint that this petition is motivated by personal animosity rather than genuine concern for your granddaughter's welfare, I will not only deny it, I will consider sanctions. She looked at Theodore. Do you wish to call any witnesses? Theodore conferred with Margaret again, and Claire could see the calculation happening. They'd expected an easy victory over a poor single mother with no resources. They hadn't expected Diane Foster. Your Honor, Theodore said finally, perhaps we've been overly hasty. If we could request a brief recess to discuss. Motion denied. Judge Moreno's voice was sharp. You brought this case. You disrupted this woman's life and forced her to defend her fitness as a mother in open court. We're going to resolve it today. She turned to Claire. Mrs. Whitmore, does your daughter currently have any relationship with her paternal grandmother? Claire stood, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. No, Your Honor. Margaret, Mrs. Whitmore. James Whitmore died on February 14, 1985, while snow fell soft as forgiveness over Washington. Claire received the call at dawn, not from Richard, who was still in Norfolk, and not from Margaret, who would never grant her the dignity of direct contact. The call came from James's private nurse, a kind Filipina woman named Rosa, who'd spent the last 3 weeks monitoring his decline. He's asking for you, Rosa said quietly. You and the little girl. He doesn't have much time. Claire dressed Emma in the dark, her hands clumsy with urgency and grief. Emma was groggy, confused, clutching her stuffed rabbit and asking questions Claire couldn't answer. Why are we going to Grandpa James's house so early? Is he sick? Will he be okay? I don't know, baby, Claire whispered, and it was the most honest thing she could offer. The Georgetown townhouse was silent except for the grandfather clock in the foyer, marking time with mechanical indifference. Rosa met them at the door, her face grave with knowledge. Mrs. Margaret is in the study, Rosa said. She asked not to be disturbed, but Mr. James has been asking for you every few minutes. They climbed the stairs to the bedroom, where James lay propped on pillows, oxygen tubes running to his nose, his breathing shallow and labored. The robust man who'd knelt on cathedral marble 4 months ago had been reduced to angles and shadows. But when he saw Emma, his eyes brightened. There's my crane maker, he whispered. Emma approached the bed with the solemn care of a child who understands that something important and sad is happening, but doesn't have words for it yet. She placed her rabbit on the blanket beside James's hand. Mr. Buttons can keep you company, she said. He's very good at making people feel better. James's smile was beautiful and breaking. Thank you, sweetheart. Claire sat in the chair beside the bed, taking James's hand carefully. It was cold, the skin paper thin, and she could feel his pulse fluttering like something trying to escape. You sent Diane, she said quietly. I made some calls, he admitted. Called in some favors. Margaret has her weapons, but I have mine. He paused to catch his breath, each word clearly costing him. Did it help? You saved me. Again. Then we're even. He squeezed her hand with what little strength remained. Claire, I need to tell you something. About Margaret. James, you don't have to. Yes, I do. Because when I'm gone, she's going to get worse before she gets better. And you need to understand why. Emma had climbed onto the window seat and was watching the snow fall, giving them the illusion of privacy that children sometimes gift to adults. When Margaret was sick, James said, when she was going through chemotherapy, I couldn't look at her. I couldn't bear to see her suffering because it meant acknowledging that I might lose her. So I threw myself into work, into the business that was failing. I convinced myself that if I could just fix the company, if I could just save our financial security, then everything else would be okay. His breathing was getting worse, rattling wet in his chest. But the company kept failing, and she kept getting sicker, and I kept running further away. The day I came into your hardware store, I'd just gotten the lab results showing that Margaret's cancer was in remission. She was going to live, and all I could feel was this terrible, crushing guilt that I'd abandoned her when she needed me most, that I'd been so consumed by my own fear that I'd failed as a husband. Claire felt tears tracking down her face. I didn't deserve her survival, James continued. I didn't deserve another chance, so I decided not to take one. I was going to end it before I could fail her again. He looked at Claire with eyes that held decades of regret. You stopped me. You gave me time to learn how to be better. But I never told Margaret about that day. Never told her how close I'd come to leaving her permanently. And she knew something had changed. She knew I'd pulled back from the edge. But she didn't know why. She deserved to know, Claire said gently. She did, but I was ashamed. And shame makes cowards of us all. James closed his eyes, exhausted. When she heard me tell you the story on the terrace, it was the first time she learned the truth. That her husband had been planning to abandon her, not just emotionally, but permanently. And that a stranger had talked him down when she couldn't. Secrets metastasize like cancer. That's why she hates me, Claire realized. Not because I'm poor or unsuitable, because I represent the moment she couldn't save you. She doesn't hate you, James said. She hates what you represent, proof that I needed saving from myself, and that she wasn't the one who could provide it. In her mind, you stole something from her. The chance to be my savior. The chance to be enough. The snow continued falling, soft and relentless, and somewhere downstairs, the grandfather clock chimed 7. What do I do? Claire whispered. Love my son, James said simply. Raise Emma to be brave and kind, and forgive Margaret when she can't forgive herself. She's going to try to destroy you, Claire. Not because you've done anything wrong, but because your existence reminds her of her own perceived failure. But underneath all that rage and control, there's a woman who spent 40 years being afraid. Afraid of what? Of not being enough, of being replaceable, of learning that love isn't a transaction you can control through perfect performance. He opened his eyes again, and they were remarkably clear. Sound familiar? Claire felt the words land in her chest like a key turning in a lock. Because yes, it was familiar. The terror that she wasn't enough, not smart enough, not sophisticated enough, not polished enough to deserve Richard's love or the Whitmore name. The constant performance of trying to be better, trying to prove her worth, trying to earn a place she'd supposedly been given freely. She and Margaret Whitmore weren't opposites. They were mirrors. Tell her, James said, his voice barely audible now. When the time is right, tell her I'm sorry. Tell her she was always enough. Tell her the failure was mine, not hers. I will. Promise me." "I promise." James relaxed back against the pillows, some essential tension releasing. Emma came over from the window seat and climbed carefully onto the bed, curling up beside him like she'd done with Claire 1,000 times when she was scared or sad. "Grandpa James," she said softly, "are you going to go to heaven?" "I think so, sweetheart." "Will you tell my grandma I said hi? My mama's mama?" "I will," James promised, and his hand found Emma's small one. "What should I tell her about you?" "Tell her I'm learning to make paper cranes, and that my mama is the best mama in the whole world, and that we have a new family now, but we still remember her every day." James looked at Claire over Emma's head, and she saw everything he couldn't say: gratitude, blessing, farewell. Then he closed his eyes, Emma's hand in his, and his breathing began to slow. Rosa appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Claire, I know." Claire stood and gently lifted Emma from the bed, though her daughter protested. "But Mama, he's holding my hand." "We need to let Grandpa James rest now, baby." "Is he dying?" The question hung in the air, too big and honest to deflect. "Yes," Claire said quietly. "He is." "Because he's old?" "Because sometimes people's bodies get too tired to keep going." Emma thought about this for a moment, then reached over and placed her paper rabbit back on James's chest. "So Mr. Buttons can go with him, so he won't be scared." And that was how James Whitmore died, with a child's toy on his chest, and the memory of kindness in his mind, and the woman he'd saved sitting vigil beside a woman who'd needed saving too. Margaret appeared in the doorway as Rosa was checking for a pulse she already knew was gone. The reading of James Whitmore's will took place on March 1st, 1985, in the law offices of Morrison & Associates, the same firm that had sent Diane Foster to Claire's rescue. The conference room overlooked Pennsylvania Avenue, and through the windows, Claire could see the first hints of spring trying to break through Washington's gray winter. Richard sat beside her, finally back from Norfolk, his uniform crisp but his eyes hollow with a grief he didn't seem to know how to express. Margaret arrived precisely on time, dressed in black Chanel, her makeup perfect, her posture impeccable. She'd spent the last 2 weeks planning James's funeral with the meticulous attention she'd once given to charity galas, every detail controlled, every emotion managed. The service had been attended by senators and business magnates and old military colleagues who'd spoken of James's integrity and vision, but who'd never seen him desperate enough to buy rope. Claire and Emma had sat in the back, uninvited to the family row, but not explicitly excluded either. A kind of limbo that seemed to define their entire relationship with the Whitmores. Now they all gathered around the conference table. Margaret, Richard, Claire, and James's younger brother Robert, who'd flown in from California for the funeral and stayed for the legal aftermath. The family lawyer, an elderly man named Harold Chen, who'd known James for 40 years, opened the leather folder with the reverent care of someone handling sacred text. James was very specific about how he wanted this handled, Harold said, looking at each of them in turn. He rewrote this will in January, knowing his time was short, and he wanted to ensure certain things were absolutely clear. Margaret's expression didn't change, but her hands tightened slightly on her handbag. "To my brother Robert," Harold read, "I leave my collection of first edition books and my restored 1957 Chevrolet, along with a trust fund of $50,000. May you finally write that novel you've been threatening to start for 30 years. Robert smiled sadly. He never stopped nagging me about that. "To my son Richard," Harold continued, "I leave controlling interest in Whitmore Steel, the Pennsylvania properties, and my seat on the board of directors." I trust you'll lead the company with more wisdom than I did and less fear. You're a better man than I was at your age. Don't waste time learning that the hard way." Richard's face was stone, but Claire saw his hand tremble as he reached for the water glass in front of him. "To my wife Margaret." Harold's voice softened. "I leave the Georgetown townhouse, the vacation home in Martha's Vineyard, my investment portfolio, and a trust that will ensure your financial security for the rest of your life. You deserved a better husband than I was, but you got me instead. I'm sorry I couldn't be the man you needed. The failure was always mine, not yours." Margaret's composure finally cracked. A single tear escaped, tracking down her cheek before she caught it with a practiced hand. She didn't make a sound, but her shoulders shook once, a tremor of grief that had nowhere to go. Sometimes I'm sorry comes too late and exactly on time. "And finally," Harold said, looking directly at Claire, "to Claire Whitmore, who saved my life when I decided it wasn't worth saving, I leave the following." The room went absolutely still. "The property at 217 4th Street, currently occupied by Henderson's Hardware, which I purchased quietly 6 months ago when I learned the owner was planning to sell to a developer. The building is yours, Claire, to do with as you wish. Keep the hardware store, start your own business, or sell it for the considerable profit such a location would bring in a gentrifying neighborhood." Claire felt the world tilt. James had bought the building? The place where she'd worked for 6 years, where she'd talked him down from suicide, where Margaret had tried to buy her off? Additionally, Harold continued, "I leave you a trust fund of $200,000 to be used for Emma's education and your own financial independence. Not because you need to be rescued, but because everyone deserves the freedom to build the life they choose rather than the life desperation forces upon them." Margaret made a sound, something between a gasp and a sob. "And finally," Harold said, his voice growing thick with emotion, "I leave you this letter, to be read privately at your convenience, but I'll share one line that James asked me to read aloud." He pulled out a handwritten page. "Claire, you taught me that kindness to strangers isn't weakness, but the highest form of courage. You gave me 4 more years with my wife, my son, and eventually my granddaughter. That's 4 years of sunrises I would have missed. 4 years of laughter and mistakes and ordinary grace. I can never repay that debt, but I can pay it forward. Use this gift to help others the way you helped me. And please, please forgive my wife. She's not your enemy. She's your sister in survival. You just survived different kinds of drowning." The silence that followed was absolute. Margaret stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely controlled. I need air." She left the conference room, and after a moment, Claire followed. She found Margaret in the hallway, leaning against the window, staring out at the traffic below with unseeing eyes. Her perfect composure had finally shattered completely. Tears streaming down her face, mascara running, her hands shaking as she pressed them against the glass. "He knew," Margaret whispered. "All this time he knew exactly what he was doing, exactly how to hurt me." "I don't think he was trying to hurt you," Claire said quietly. "Then what was he doing? Leaving a fortune to the woman who replaced me in his affections? Asking me to forgive you when you took the last good piece of him? I didn't take anything from you." "Yes, you did." Margaret turned, and her face was raw with 40 years of accumulated pain. "You took the story, the narrative, the myth of James Whitmore that I'd been building our entire marriage. I was supposed to be the one who saved him from his darkness. I was the one who survived cancer and kept our household running and raised our son while he built his empire. But at the end, when it mattered most, when he was going to throw it all away, you were the one he remembered. You were the one who gets credit for his redemption. The truth of it hung between them like a bridge over an impossible distance. "You're right," Claire said. Margaret blinked, clearly expecting an argument. "You're right," Claire repeated. "You did save him. You survived cancer and held your family together and endured a husband who couldn't see your suffering because he was drowning in his own. I just happened to be the person working at a hardware store on the afternoon he decided to ask for rope. That's not virtue, Margaret. That's just geography and timing." "Then why did he leave you everything?" "He didn't leave me everything. He left me a building and money for his granddaughter's future. He left you 40 years of shared history and a fortune and the company he spent his life building. He left you the substance. I just got the symbol." Margaret's tears were falling freely now, and she didn't try to stop them. "I hated you so much," she whispered. "When I heard him tell that story on the terrace, when I realized he'd nearly left me and I never even knew, I wanted to destroy you. I wanted you to hurt the way I was hurting. I know. The lawsuit, the phone calls, the whisper campaign, all of it. I know. And you still came to sit with him while he died." Claire thought about the paper crane on James's bedside table, about Emma's rabbit resting on his chest, about the way Margaret had stood in the doorway watching her husband slip away and had looked, just for a moment, grateful not to be alone. "He loved you," Claire said. "Whatever his failures, whatever he couldn't give you, he loved you. And so did I, in a way, because you were part of him, and he was part of the story that changed my life." Margaret covered her face with her hands, and for the first time since they'd met, she looked small, breakable, human. "I don't know how to not be angry," she said. "I don't know who I am without the rage." "Then stay angry," Claire said. "But maybe we could be angry together instead of at each other." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even friendship. But it was something. Margaret lowered her hands, her makeup ruined, her perfect facade destroyed. "He asked you to forgive me." "He did." "Do you?" Claire thought about the lawsuit and the whispers and the months of fear. She thought about Emma crying because kids at school had said her mother was a gold digger. She thought about all the ways Margaret had tried to make her feel small and unwelcome and insufficient. And then she thought about the woman on the front steps in a silk robe, looking uncertain for the first time. About the way Margaret had touched James's hand in those final moments with a tenderness that spoke of decades of complicated love. "I'm working on it," Claire said honestly. "Ask me again in a year." Margaret's laugh was broken but genuine. "That's fair." They stood in the hallway while life continued around them. Lawyers conducting business. In 10 years later, on an October afternoon when the light fell golden across 4th Street, Emma Whitmore stood in the hardware store arranging donation baskets for the community center's coat drive. She was 16 now, tall and graceful, with her mother's honey-colored hair and her father's steady presence. But it was her eyes, those gray eyes that missed nothing, that marked her as someone who'd learned early that kindness wasn't weakness, but the bravest choice a person could make. "Mom, we're out of donation forms," she called toward the back office, where Claire was reviewing the store's books with the same careful attention she'd once given to making rent on a cashier's salary. "Check the filing cabinet," Claire called back. "Second drawer." The hardware store had changed over the decade. The community center occupied the entire second floor now. Meeting rooms, a small library, a kitchen where volunteers served free meals twice a week. The bulletin boards Emma had suggested were covered with job postings, housing opportunities, support group meetings, and hand-drawn thank you notes from people whose lives had been quietly transformed by a place that noticed when they were drowning. The bell above the door chimed, and Margaret Whitmore entered carrying 2 cups of coffee from the cafe down the street. She was 71 now, her hair completely silver, but she moved with the same determined elegance she'd always possessed. Time had softened her edges without erasing them entirely. "I brought the good kind," Margaret announced, handing Emma one of the cups. "Not that institutional sludge your mother insists is perfectly adequate." "Grandma, you know she only drinks that to annoy you," Emma said, accepting the coffee with a grin. "I'm aware." Margaret's smile was wry. "Annoying me has become something of a family tradition." Claire emerged from the office, reading glasses perched on her nose, and accepted the second coffee with the grace of long practice. "You're early. I thought we weren't starting the memorial setup until 3. "I wanted to see the space before the others arrived," Margaret said, "to make sure everything is appropriate." Today marked 10 years since James Whitmore's death, and they'd planned a small memorial gathering. Not the formal, stiff affair that Margaret's instincts demanded, but something more intimate. Family and a few close friends gathering to share stories and remember a complicated man who'd gotten some things wrong and a few things magnificently right. The 3 of them climbed the stairs to the community center, where folding chairs had been arranged in a circle and photographs of James lined the walls. James in his Navy uniform. James at the steel mill. James kneeling on cathedral marble, placing shoes on a bride's feet in the most famous photograph ever taken at St. Michael's Cathedral. That image had appeared in the Washington Post the day after the wedding. A local photographer had captured the moment, and it had become briefly famous. A story of unexpected grace, of dignity bestowed rather than earned, of a powerful man choosing humility over pride. What the newspaper story hadn't known was everything that came after. "I still can't believe he bought this building and never told me," Margaret said, running her hand along the wall where a plaque read, "The James Whitmore Community Center, where everyone deserves to be noticed." "He was good at secrets," Claire observed. "Too good." Margaret turned from the photographs. "But his last secret was the right one. This place, what you've built here, it's exactly what he would have wanted." Over the decade, Claire had transformed the hardware store into something James probably couldn't have imagined, but would have recognized immediately. A place where the desperate could find help, where the lonely could find community, where someone standing at the edge of a bridge might find a reason to turn around. They'd helped 63 people find housing, connected 217 people with jobs, provided emergency funds to families facing eviction, talked down 4 people from suicide attempts, connected them with counseling, checked in on them until the crisis passed. The building on 4th Street had become exactly what Claire had promised, a place where people were noticed. "Your father would have liked this," Claire said to Emma. "The community center. The work we're doing." Richard Whitmore had died 3 years ago in a training accident at sea. A freak storm, equipment failure, and the particular kind of bad luck that military families learn to carry. His death had been devastating, but it had also crystallized something, had forced Claire and Margaret to choose whether their tentative peace would survive the loss of the man who'd connected them. They'd chosen to survive together. Not easily, Not without arguments and setbacks and days when the old resentments flared bright and hot. But they'd survived. For Emma's sake initially, and then eventually for their own. "Tell me the story," Emma said, settling into one of the folding chairs. "The real one, not the newspaper version." It had become a tradition. Emma asking for the true story of how her family had been forged from broken pieces, and Claire and Margaret taking turns filling in the details that no outsider could know. Margaret spoke first, her voice steady. "Your grandfather came into this hardware store on an August afternoon, intending to buy rope to kill himself. Your mother, who was 22 years old with a baby on her back, looked at him and somehow knew. She kept him talking, kept him alive, gave him terrible coffee and hope in equal measure. And then he disappeared," Claire continued, "and I forgot about him. I had 100 other desperate people to serve that year, 100 other crises to navigate. I never knew if that conversation mattered. Until 4 years later," Emma prompted, knowing the story but needing to hear it again. "Until 4 years later, when my heel broke walking down the aisle, and this powerful man I didn't recognize knelt down and gave me his shoes." Claire smiled at the memory. "And I realized that kindness has a long tail, that we never know which moments matter until years later when they bloom into something we couldn't have predicted. Small mercies grow into gardens." Margaret pulled an envelope from her handbag. Cream stationery, expensive, the kind she'd used her entire life for important correspondence. "I have something for you, Emma. I've been waiting for the right time, and I think today is it." Emma opened the envelope carefully. Inside, a check for $100,000 and a letter in Margaret's precise handwriting. "Grandma, this is—" "Your college fund," Margaret interrupted. "Or your business fund. Or your travel the world and find yourself fund. I don't care what you use it for. But I want you to have choices, the way your mother didn't. The way I didn't, really, for all my privilege." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll use it wisely. Say you'll remember that wealth is a responsibility, not a right. Say you'll keep noticing people the way your mother taught you." Margaret's voice was gruff with emotion. "And maybe, if you're feeling generous, say you'll visit your cantankerous grandmother occasionally even after you leave for college." "Every week," Emma promised, launching herself into Margaret's arms. "I'll visit every week." Claire watched them embrace and felt something complete itself. A circle that had started with broken shoes and coffee and a desperate man had closed into family. Imperfect, complicated, earned rather than given, but real. The memorial gathering began at 3, just as the October light turned amber. About 30 people filled the community center. Richard's Navy colleagues, business associates of James's, volunteers from the hardware store, and a handful of people whose lives had been changed by the community center's work. They shared stories, laughed at James's terrible jokes, cried at his failures, and celebrated his redemptions. And when it was Claire's turn to speak, she stood before the circle and told the truth. "James Whitmore gave me shoes when mine broke," she said. "But more than that, he gave me permission to walk tall in a world that had spent my entire life telling me to be smaller. He saw value in a hardware store clerk with a baby and no prospects, and he made sure I knew that value was real." She paused, looking at Margaret. "But he also left me with a responsibility. He asked me to forgive his wife, to understand that we were both surviving different kinds of drowning. And I'm grateful he did, Because the last 10 years of navigating grief and business and motherhood alongside Margaret Whitmore have taught me something James probably knew all along. "What's that?" someone asked. "That family isn't about blood or marriage certificates or social standing. It's about choosing, every day, to show up for each other even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." Margaret wiped her eyes with a handkerchief, and across the circle, Emma smiled. After the gathering ended and the guests departed, the three of them stood in the hardware store among the hammers and paint cans and community bulletin boards. The same space where everything had started a decade ago. "Do you think he knew?" Emma asked. "Grandpa James? Do you think he knew what would happen after he died? How we'd all end up here together?" Claire and Margaret exchanged glances. "I think," Margaret said slowly, "he hoped. And hope, when you're brave enough to act on it, sometimes looks a lot like prophecy." The October evening deepened into dusk, and they locked up the hardware store together. 3 generations of women who'd learned that the shoes you walk in matter less than the ground you choose to walk on. That grace appears in unexpected forms. That sometimes the people who save you are the ones you least expect. And that kindness, real kindness, the kind that costs you something, never disappears. It just changes form, blooming into futures you couldn't have imagined. On 4th Street, they say, late at night you can still sometimes find a pair of polished Oxford shoes sitting on the front step of the hardware store. No one knows who leaves them or why. But in the morning, they're always gone, claimed by someone who needs them, who understands that sometimes the greatest gifts come without explanation, offered by strangers who see your need and choose to care. The shoes appear and disappear like grace itself, unpredictable, unearned, and absolutely real. If this story moved you, leave a comment below sharing a time someone showed you unexpected kindness, and subscribe, because every week we're uncovering stories of ordinary people who changed the world with simple acts of grace.